Collection of talks on Nokodemions teaching from contact reports from 700s to 7.
Contact Report 710.
Unfortunately, that was indeed the case, but it was the fault of the Earthlings concerned, because they... But now, I want to continue with what I was saying. Certain abductions of human beings from Earth for various purposes, and thus, of course, the corresponding contacts, which have taken place again and again since time immemorial, have always belonged to the behavior of the old Earth foreigners and Earth future, as well as to the newer ones who fly in and out of Earth and back again. But the fact is, in spite of abductions, etc., that none of these Earth foreigners and Earth foreigners have, up to the present time, conveyed any messages and the like to the Earthlings, precisely messages with regard to how they would have fallen, or would fall today, within the framework of the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, and thus within the sphere of the Nokodemion and my mission. Likewise, like the Earth foreigners are at times to be observed in earthly space with their futuristic flying apparatuses, though the Earth foreigners have just as nothing to do with them as you. Plei-Aran have nothing to do with them, nor with the Earth foreigners. You Plei-Aran yourselves have always shielded yourselves from the Earth foreigners when you appear on Earth who have also been working on Earth for a long time. And your shielding from them is such that you cannot be perceived by them in any way, neither visually nor can you be located or registered by any apparatus. Your general Plei-Aran technology, so also space technology and space-time bridging technology, etc., have been so highly developed for millions of years, through the help of the Sonair from the Dal universe or the Dal creation, that the Earth foreigners functioning on Earth have never been able to locate, detect or otherwise register any flying apparatus of Plei-Aran origin, or also only any Plei-Aran activities since their existence in prehistoric times up to the present time. So the Earth foreigners, who work on Earth and are observed again and again, have nothing to do with you Plei-Aran, just as you have nothing to do with the Earth foreigners and Earth future, whereby, as explained, you are in no way to be located, otherwise recognizable or registerable for them. Moreover, you did not and do not interfere in any way with any earthly political, military, and economic concerns, but have endeavored over all the past millennia to develop in many ways all fields of knowledge and development by transmitting impulses to certain scientists, inventors, and researchers, etc.
Which you have openly and clearly explained correctly. And that this was indeed the case can be proven since then and today, as well as in the future with all new personalities of the succession lineage of the Nokodemion spirit form, and thus, after Emmanuel, thus also with you. This is because through the level of Arahat Athersata, a mark was determined and set, which is to prove the truth of the successors of Emmanuel until far into the future.
Congenital mark on the right side of Billy's body as determined by the level of Arahat Athersata.
And this is given because it has been foreseen that many deceivers and delusionists will appear with lies, deceit and fraud, and through delusion and sectarianism, and will presume to pass themselves off as direct reincarnations of Christ. And this will happen, as was foresightedly recognized, although a rebirth of an Earth human being cannot be possible, because only his spirit form is classified as reincarnation. Consequently, only a new personality can be born, not reborn, which has an entirely different individuality, a different appearance, a different form, as well as an absolutely different nature and other peculiarities than these factors were inherent in the old and deceased personality. This is also rightly taught by you through the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life. And now, as to the mark formed by the plane Arahat Athersata, and ordained that all later personalities of the Nokodemion spirit form, after the occurrence of the lance stitch in Emmanuel, should bear a faint but visible mark on the right side of the trunk between the diaphragm and pelvis respectively, This is to serve as a mark of recognition of the correctness of a successor personality of Emmanuel. Through the presence of this weak scar mark, Earth humans who prove themselves to be endeavoring and learning with regard to the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and thus as observant reasoners, shall be able to demonstrably recognize the successor personalities of Emmanuel and thus also the spirit-form lineage of Nokodemion if they should necessarily be urged to do so by the sense.
For me, it is absolutely clear that this Jesus Sananda Emmanuel sect, that is to say the originator of the whole thing, has stolen my materials of the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and transformed them according to his own sense, and is now spreading everything under the direction of the present sect leadership, as already Glanzmann did, and has since then spread everything around the world as his teaching. In addition, the authorship is not exactly well educated in the art of writing, just as it is not exactly a bright light of intelligentity with its interwoven, pathologically stupid sectarian phantasmagoria, for very much is so deviant that it effectively appears underdeveloped in terms of consciousness, and thus primitive. Everything has clearly been copied, stolen and falsified not only from the teachings, but also from the contact reports, as a result of unreason and lack of understanding, and this obviously already in the 1970s or 1980s as well as in the 1990s, because this sect has been functioning since then, as it still does today with the Pleiades, which we then called the alleged origin of the Pleiaren, in order to mislead deceivers, liars, and charlatans, and to be able to expose them as delusional, liars, and deceivers, which then also worked. But this is exactly what this sect did not understand, neither then nor now, which is why it is still muddling around with the Pleiades, and thus leads itself ad absurdum and reveals itself as a lying and deceiving sect. In all this, God is also used to a great extent, so it is clear from everything that a religious sectarianism is in the foreground.
Contact Report 711.
I think you are setting out to challenge me today. But good. Then I will satisfy your opinion and at least take up the important facts and disclose them. But first I want to tell you what you asked me a long time ago, namely what the Sonura Lake and the dwarf creatures were all about. As you said, I was able to find records about it in my father Svath's annals, which also revealed facts that were completely foreign to me and very interesting. According to his annals, he explored the earth at many times in the past, and nearly 40,000 years ago he also came across Lake Sonura, where at that time the elevated terrain above the present center was inhabited by small-bodied human beings who averaged 115 centimeters in height and were the most distant descendants of the first terrestrial hominids. In addition to these small human beings, some of whose most distant descendants are still to be found in Africa as pygmies, as well as in Asia, my father Svath also researched their origins, which took him to many other areas of the earth where he came across other various smaller groups of small human beings in Europe, Africa, South and North America, in Australia and Asia. These were all different, however, and ranged up to 160 centimeters in height, were differently pigmented, and also had anatomical differences. Interested, he continued his research into the past of Earth history and Earth humans, and traced the developmental processes of hominids back to the early times of 17 million years. He then went back many more millions of years into the past, and around 45 million years ago in the area that is now Germany, came across first life forms that developed into a form in early times, from which the hominid evolution emerged around 17 million years ago, and from which, in the course of further millions of years, small-bodied human beings ultimately developed. He discovered these life forms at the place where he was also together with you, in order to teachingly instruct you where the actual original origin of the visible human life form began in the area that you know as the Messel Pit near Darmstadt. This first development of the life form, which led to the creation of the first hominid species, was found there for the very first time by my father Svath, from which, over many millions of years, the effective first human being emerged from the descendants that developed from it in what is now known as North Africa, as well as in areas that are now called Europe, South Africa, South and North America, Asia, and Australia. So he established that all the small human beings he researched arose at approximately the same time all over the earth, and that they were the first and oldest human beings on Earth, completely contrary to the false research results of today's earthly scientific anthropology, whose alleged knowledge is based only on incorrect and hypothetical or made-up assertions. Thus, it has been recognized by research in the past that the very first effective human beings on the Earth were small ones who emerged naturally in various areas from the planet and its nature, fauna and flora itself. So the origin of the Earth humanity was correctly found in Africa. As Earth anthropology teaches correctly, but not in the wise it was thought, because early Earth human history did not begin at the time calculated according to the earliest remains of the genus Homo in Africa, but millions of years much earlier. According to the research of my father Svath, all findings on Earth concerning the earliest hominids correspond only to bones of human beings who evolved from the first genus Homo and thus from the first generation of the human species. As a result, the dwarfs, as you always call them, and because of which you have erected various artificial dwarf figures in the center, who were effectively the very first Earth-created human beings, gave rise to the taller, normal-bodied beings who populate the world today in vast excess. However, it must also be clearly explained that the hominid development of the human species did not take place uniformly, but in manifold temporal and spatial gradations, when the process of the actual becoming and the evolutionary adaptation of the Earth-human phenotypic anatomy in relation to the small stature of the first life form of Earth humans began about 17 million years ago. These were, however, human beings of normal height and therefore not comparable with the short stature or short stature of the short stature known on Earth today. This short stature is the result of various symptoms of different basic diseases, which impair the growth of the body and the development of the limbs, whereby it is misconceivedly assumed by innocent Earth humans that these short-statured human beings are cognitively handicapped. This, however, corresponds to an unparalleled error and misjudgment, for these human beings, impaired by dwarfism, are as a rule absolutely normal and equal to the so-called normal human beings with regard to the development of consciousness, intellect, reason, and intelligence, and thus also to all cognitive and physical abilities, and thus also with regard to reproduction. Consequently, they are in no way inferior to the normal human beings in these respects. As far as Lake Sanura is concerned, as I have already explained to you, it encompassed the entire area of today's Schmidruti, Sitzberg, and Bühl, or the Pyrg area, and was therefore a very large lake. On the elevated shore, the terrain was inhabited, namely on an elevated position above the point where the center stands today, whereby you call the terrains in question Haus Kansel and Hintere Kansel. This, while today's center is built directly on the spot where at the time of the lake's existence, there was a shore covered with phragmites, note Billy. Phragmites, Church reed, as these plants still grow today in the shore zones of water bodies, whereby you came across the old shore ground during excavations under the center and near the shed, and also found phragmites remains from that time. However, At another time in the past, when my father visited Lake Sonora about 800 years ago, he found it no longer there. So he investigated what had happened, and through further visits to the past, he was able to establish that the dam of Lake Sonora had been torn up and washed away by severe earthquakes, below where the inlet to the Stone Valley is today. And all that remains to be explained is that my father, according to his annals, remembered the ancient OM teachings that you have rewritten and reproduced in Canon 20, verse 1102, so that some 29,800 years ago in the past, he judged the area around the former Sonora Lake to be so ideal and the hoof of the horse that this must be the place of the sage, as it is already described in the ancient OM. So he decided to mediate at the level of Arahat Athersata that one day, when he had to take over the task of your instruction, you should on the one hand be conceived and born through parents who should have a direct connection to the area of the former lake. And on the other hand, you should also become familiar with the whole area around the former Sonora Lake from your youngest youth, so that one day you can build up a place there to spread the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life for the whole earth world. And through the immeasurable help of the plane Arahat Athersata, despite all the tremendous adversities, the noble intention of my father Sfath has been realized, and so today the center actually exists and works out into the whole world. These, Edward, my dear friend, are the facts from my father's infinite records of his annals, of which I have only become aware in the last few days, and can now also tell you. But this could indeed us arten to get very badly out of control of the good human nature, in the manner you said, which is why I must not consider any further details and explanations and explain anything in more detail. However, I may explain, which I will do only briefly and without elaboration, what happened to our ancestors 52,000 years ago, but I really do not intend to go into detail. It turned out that the swinging wave impulses emitted by the aforementioned spherical flying machine very effectively influenced certain areas of the brain of all the planet's inhabitants and had such an effect on special areas that all impulses of violence and degeneracy were appeased, but not extinguished, only put into a softened state and made peaceful. This was sufficient for the populations of all the planets to fall away from all malignant violence and become in a peaceful mood within the time during which the spherical flying machine circled the worlds. But nevertheless they retained their free will and, above all, without external verbal influences from the state leaders and their unpeaceful propaganda, etc., they became more and more inclined to rationality and intellect, and began to think, consider, decide, and act independently. The calming, swinging wave influences, which acted only on certain areas of the brain and in these only on special areas, were neither aggressive nor compelling, for there were only vibratory impulses through which understanding and reason were stimulated and led to the populations discarding their collective world of thought within a few days, because they became free from all the unpeaceful, suggestive collective thinking controlled by the governments and religions, and were able to form their own independent thoughts and opinions. By very quickly discarding their collective thinking controlled by governments and religions, and also very quickly learning and using their own individual thoughts, the human beings of the Pleiaren planets learned and grasped their personal self-knowledge and formed their own and ever-increasing self-determination, through which they attained personal mental strength. In a special way, the dropping and abandonment of all religious belief factors and thus the perception and realization of the natural creational laws, which are universally oriented towards peacefulness, freedom, and self-reliance, had an effect. When this was recognized by all Pleiaren populations of all our worlds, and every religious belief was discarded and frowned upon, manifold realizations were formed, and from them the result of personal attitudes and far-reaching thought processes and certainties, which led to all human beings of all peoples setting themselves independently challenging goals and sticking to them even under difficulties, learning to cope with failures better and well, working out a higher motivation and achieving their set self-realization goals. It was also found that within only 11 days, they were less and less distracted by the opinions of other persons, and above all, also no longer allowed themselves to be distracted by the suggestive, unpeaceful whispers of the government, nor allowed themselves to fall back into unpeacefulness. On the contrary, all the populations of all the planets henceforth made all the necessary efforts and perseverance to achieve their goals. Very quickly they became aware of their own abilities and, just as quickly learned to control and master situations of all kinds that arose and quickly became mentally strong. Persons who also learned to make use of their abilities by constantly seeking and finding new challenges for their intellect and reason, as well as for their self-development and self-realization, and by realizing them as well as themselves. Thus, within a very short time, the individual human beings learned to cope with stress and strain and to live in control of all their self-created personality traits. Through their steadily growing mental strength, they very quickly created a consciousness-like capacity that also had a strong effect on their mental and physical health, as well as on the fact that they were always setting themselves new, challenging goals and realizing them. And all this, together with many other positive developments, finally led within only 32 days, during which the orbital aircraft circled the worlds, to all persons of all. Populations finally freeing themselves independently and according to their own free will from all Ausartungen, getting very badly out of control of their good human natures, and from all violence and immorality, etc. Through the unimaginably strong, swinging wave impulses of evolutionary effect, which were emitted by the flying sphere and influenced the personalities of all our Pleiaren planets, all human beings became aware within a very short time that they were being influenced externally by other persons, forces and populist and unpeaceful government-controlled influences which were hostile to peace, degenerate, inciting violence and destructive, as well as impairing the intellect and reason, negative and malignant, and were influencing them negatively against their own will and causing them to lapse into violence, etc. This realization led the human beings of all our planets to renounce violence, immorality, degeneracy, evil, and wickedness, and also to conquer their bad habits. It was also recognized, however, that in spite of all knowledge and efforts with regard to the conduct of life in the good, the correct, the human, and with regard to righteousness, as well as with regard to the observance of the natural positive creative laws, the human being always remains susceptible and can fall back again into old ungood, negative, evil, and bad behavior if he does not make the necessary effort to control it in order to prevent it. And it has been recognized that this can always happen again if the human beings are influenced from the outside in any verbal, physical, or consciousness, thought, emotion, and psyche, burdening forms for long enough. So in this respect, all human beings of all Pleiaren planets or their populations were subordinated to this natural creative law of action in such a way that countermeasures had to be taken, which were recorded and followed in directives, and which consisted in the fact that no direct or otherwise harmful connections were to be sought and maintained with alien worlds and their populations, in order not to relapse into the old modes of behavior through such contacts with alien peoples who were not like our ancestors. We Pleiaren of today are also human beings, like our ancestors 52,000 years ago and all our descendants since then, who must resist such external influences without being harmed. For unfortunately, we are still susceptible to negative, external influences that would cause us to relapse into the old ways of behavior if we were to fall long enough into areas of negative influence that were harmful to us and were hit by factors that had a negative effect on us. We Pleiaren, too, are human beings and are ordered to develop within the framework of every natural creational order and lawfulness through a very laborious working out of our higher evolution of consciousness, which even after 52,000 years of peace we must follow and continue to learn. And this we can do today through the life teaching of Nokodemion, the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, which helps us unspeakably much in our further evolution of consciousness, but which was known to us only in small parts up to the beginning of your mission, but which you now bring and teach not only to Earth humans, but also to us, in many expanded versions. But as far as our ancestors were concerned, more than 52,000 years ago, they only gained their knowledge at that time, and only then became aware of the effective facts and values of life according to the natural creative laws. When the flying sphere appeared and circled around our Pleiaren planets, whereby all Pleiaren populations were struck by its vibratory impulses and were appeased and peacefully tuned in a restrained yet definite and effective manner. Through these vibratory impulses, their minds and reason were stimulated, whereby the populations turned to the gently urging peaceful impulses and gave themselves consciously learning to their evolution of consciousness. Through this attention, our ancestors of that time recognized the truth and effectiveness of the natural creative laws and correct natural creative conditioned way of life, learned to fathom them and to follow them and made them their own, whereby henceforth all populations consciously developed according to them and aligned themselves to them in every way. But they were able to do all this only after they realized that their entire very high technical development in all its forms and possibilities did not turn them away from their degenerations, their violent behavior, and from all evil, from all warfare and all destructive and negative and evil behavior with regard to peace, real freedom, righteousness, justice, and humanity, as well as a way of life according to natural creative laws. Only through the influence of the vibrational impulses, which were emitted by the spherical flying device and by which they were peacefully influenced, did they find their way to personal change, and finally, through their own development of consciousness, cognition and their efforts, their own will, their intellect, their reason, and the use of their intelligence, they attained their personal inner peace, their personal inner freedom and righteousness. And this inestimable gain and victory over themselves they also began to bring to bear externally, whereby all peoples also allied themselves among themselves in a continuing state of peace and freedom. And since then, all violence, degenerations, and wars, etc., have also become a thing of the past. However, it must be repeated as a fact that all violence, wars, all hatred and falsehood, all discord, all unfreedom and unrighteousness, as well as all injustice and degeneracy, etc., in all forms, could only be ended. In all forms could only be brought to an end when the vibratory impulses of the orb had an effect upon all the Pleiaren peoples and soothed them into peace, whereby they became consciously powerful of their own independent and externally uninfluenced faculty of thought, as well as of their intellect, their reason, and the application of their intelligentsia, and thereby their own self-evolution, could take place. This did not mean, however, that our ancestors 52,000 years ago or since we're above any susceptibility to and reversion to the old degenerate, malignant, warlike, violent, and all other negative forms, and disregarding all natural creative laws. And this is not the case even in modern times, for even we Pleiaren of today are not immune to this, just as all our ancestors were not. This is well known to us Pleiaren, and we also know through the teaching of Nokodemion that in order to be above all susceptibility and backsliding into the old negative patterns of degenerations, violence, wars, hatred, falsehood and wickedness, etc., it takes much more than just the change to peace, freedom, justice, and righteousness, etc. in the human being, and that all this cannot simply be worked out through the normal development of understanding, reason, intelligence, and knowledge. But this very much more is only possible for a human being, no matter who, how, what, and from where he is, whether from Earth, from our Pleiaren planets, or elsewhere, when very thoroughly and intensively throughout all times it is learned to perceive reality and the truth contained therein, and to implement all the resulting knowledge for self and self-development in a correct, positive, and evolutionary way. And the comprehensive realization which gradually matured in all the human beings of our Pleiaren populations also led to the realization of the fact that all becoming of all natural creative flourishing requires long periods of time, which in this respect led all Pleiaren peoples to the realization and understanding that they would never stop learning, but would have to learn all their lives and keep on learning, because learning would never come to an end, but would continue endlessly and also in every new life, in relation to every new personality. So it became clear and understandable that learning must never end, and therefore must always continue in each new life of each new personality for many millennia, decades, thousands, centuries, thousands, and millions of years until the eventual entrance into the higher planes of the High Council and higher. But this also meant, and this was recognized in the course of time, that throughout all the times that the human being incarnates again and again as a new personality and exists and lives as a material life form, he must endlessly learn and keep on learning, which is why he, as a learning human being, will also never be immune from making mistakes again and again in order to learn from them and to continue everything better and learning positively. However, this was also connected with the realization that as a result of the lifelong learning process of each new personality, there was also the danger and possibility, connected with and timeless throughout all new incarnations and new personalities, of falling back into the old behavior patterns of earlier personalities, despite each higher development achieved. But it was recognized that especially suggestive verbal, thought, and emotion-related influences, as well as consciousness and psychic disturbances, and manifold deed-related external influences from fellow human beings can bring about and cause very negative relapses with regard to behavior of every kind. And this realization that such outside influences from fellow human beings have a suggestive effect and provoke and evoke relapses into old negative behavior patterns and ultimately allow them to be broken through, led to directives being drawn up which warned against and forbade this, that henceforth no more off-planet contacts and connections were to be cultivated with peoples or individual life forms whose life and behavioral evolutionary level, as well as their consciousness, thought, feeling, psyche, action, and reason rationality was lower than the general average of the Pleiaren population in this respect. And these directives have been preserved throughout the ages up to the present day, and thus continue to be valid even into the most distant future. This is because we have known for 52,000 years through the teachings of Nokodemion, which you impart to our humanity, as well as to Earth humans that through various external, suggestive, or any other negative influences, the susceptibility to relapse into old negative patterns and norms is always given in all human beings in universal breadth. Consequently, we Pleiaren are also disadvantaged by such energies and forces acting upon us, and could relapse into old behavior patterns. But we have to protect ourselves against this, whereby we behave in this respect according to our directives, fulfill them unswervingly in observance and compliance, and therefore run no risk of suffering any harm. Through the teaching of Nokodemion, which you impart to us, we now also know that the human being is so long prone to setbacks and relapses into old negative forms of old behavior until he no longer needs his material body, which will only be when his spirit form enters the higher plane of the High Council. Only then will the consciousness of the human being have reached a higher stage of evolution and can also profit from it and usefully perceive, apply, and effectively implement the ever-positive impulses from the spirit form in consciousness. But if this is not the case, then the possibility of danger always remains with regard to susceptibility and backsliding into old negative mental and behavioral patterns, etc., which is why it must always be fought against, and everything must be consciously controlled so that a relapse into the old degenerated patterns is avoided. And this danger of relapse always exists in any case, and with every human being if he is suggestively influenced from outside in his consciousness, his intellect, his reason, and his intelligence, etc., and if his spirit form has also not yet evolved to a sufficiently high degree. But this is also the case with us Pleiaren in this way, because our consciousness and intellect, our reason, and our intelligentsia, due to the lack of a sufficiently high evolution of consciousness, are still susceptible to degenerated external influences of every possible kind, whereby in particular linguistic and deed-related influences from outside and behavioral patterns of human beings directly affecting us are such that they could have a negative effect on us and throw us back into the old degenerations and effects, which were still peculiar to our ancestors 52,000 years ago, and from which we must also protect ourselves in the present time and still very far into the future. In this respect, respectively, also, our very highly developed technology of every kind cannot protect us, since we can only use it for ourselves in many other ways, whereas we are dependent on our intellect, our reason, our intelligence, and our directives in every respect with regard to our evolution, mentality, and all our behavior, in order to preserve and not to endanger the high values of life of every kind and manner, which we have continuously acquired through our ancestors and ourselves. And this corresponds to something that may seem incomprehensible to the majority of Earth humans, as well as to the fact that, for these reasons, we cannot and must not get involved in any direct or other contacts and connections with other thinking and other living life forms or human beings, such as Earth humans. This fact is therefore one of the most important reasons why we Pleiaren hold back, and, in accordance with our security and our directives created in this respect, are not allowed to enter into any direct or telepathic contact or any form of technical communication with persons and peoples of other worlds. This is precisely when they are not like our Pleiaren values in their forms of mentality and behavior, as well as in their way of life and in their use of intellect, reason, and intelligence, etc., but are degenerate and violent to the contrary, as well as criminally deficient in respect of righteousness and the observance of the natural creative laws, as is very distinctly the case with Earth humans, among whom only very few exceptions are to be found, who, if not extensively, yet at least in part, endeavor to learn a better, positive, and natural creative correct way of life. The negative factors mentioned, as they are drastically present in Earth humans, also occur in the third grouping as well as in the Earth future beings, who on the one hand have already been on Earth for thousands of years or otherwise for a considerable time, again and again demonstrating their presence in various ways. These explanations should suffice, for I have thus clarified the most important facts.
Thanks. I also have something on this from a person with whom I have been in contact for several years and who is very interested in our cause of mission, as is also the case, as you know, of the government official from in Germany who used to come here when Guido was still alive and whose name I have to conceal at least as long as he is still alive, as was also the case with Franz Josef Strauss. Although contact has slackened somewhat since Guido died, he is still interested in the mission and also goes along with it, although he is actually a human being who believes in God, although he says that he can integrate the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life extensively into his faith. The person, however, whom I first addressed, well, you know it too, is a member of the 732 elected MEPs from the European Parliament EP, and provides me now and then with some information that is not publicly negotiated and kept secret in the EU Parliament. I was not supposed to speak openly about this, but I was allowed, if I remain within the bounds of secrecy regarding the name of the person and the position and say nothing, to mention this, and to disclose some of what was explained to me. This, however, really only if and with the promise that I do not mention the name of the person in question, and also that certain details of his or her activity in the EU dictatorship remain undisclosed, which of course I have committed myself to do, as a consequence of which I am also not allowed to say in our core group who the person is and what his or her activity in the EU dictatorship is. Therefore, I can now also say what she sent me 4 days ago, as you can see here by the date in which you can read yourself, after which I must destroy the whole thing.
That will not be necessary, because we did not mention any names or positions of office, whereas I also think that certain people should know and be concerned about the fact that state officials in Switzerland and Germany are also just as well disposed towards you as is that person of the info secta in Zurich as well as the officiating pastor and the likewise officiating pastor of who. However, all have to hold back and conceal just as much that they are in contact with you, and insert much from the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life in their sermons, as I have already noticed several times when I listen to their pulpit speeches.
Contact Report 712.
I've already said once that when it comes to the empty phrases of the preachers of God being put into practice and lived, everything then evaporates into smoke and mirrors, and the whole thing turns out to be nothing more than idiotic, stupid empty talk, from which, however, those who listen to the preachers of God make a profit. And they do this because they are considered good believers who diligently go to the house of God and listen to the word of God. After which, however, when they have to take on their daily troubles again in the everyday life of reality, they get angry about it and express and show their true outer and inner being again. And they do this by harassing, harrying, insulting, and, if possible, materially damaging or even psychologically or physically injuring the enmity, aversion and hatred that blaze within them against their fellow human beings, people of other faiths, certain groups, and those who are richer and wealthier than they are in every possible way. And the more extensive the overpopulation grows, the more human beings fall prey to these ways of life and behavior, for with the growth of the world's population, all evil happenings of all kinds expand into steadily worse consequences. For the greater the rate of overpopulation increases, the more discord and unfreedom, indifference and injustice, as well as strife, envy and ill will, hatred, enmity, and violent violence in all relationships and directions increase among human beings, from which, in the end, wars and terrorism are the catastrophic consequences. However, the growing overpopulation and the resulting machinations, Manipulations and maneuvers of various kinds also bring nature and the whole Earth, the atmosphere and the climate into turmoil, causing damage and destruction, as a result of which these are not only increasingly impaired in their function, but are slowly but surely irreparably destroyed and even finally annihilated, and, in addition, the most diverse life forms, which are important for all life, are hopelessly wiped out. The creative natural laws and commandments are written in the goblet of the truth, etc. Also in the teaching of the Spirit, as teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, the observance of which is of vital importance for humanity. However, only very few human beings care about this, because the great masses are not interested in it, but only in pushing overpopulation further and thus destroying the Earth, its nature, fauna and flora, the atmosphere, the climate, and ultimately the planet, by irresponsibly and criminally exploiting the Earth's resources to the last possible usable one, and thereby also throwing the Earth out of balance and causing it to egg in its course around the Sun. Furthermore, the forests are also being robbed, deforested, and destroyed by the machinations of overpopulation in order to satisfy all kinds of unnecessary needs of mankind. In the process, more and more fertile land is also being destroyed for housing and new workplaces, factories, roads, sports fields and amusement parks, and all kinds of other unnecessary necessities, whereby the habitats of nature and its fauna and flora, and of course also for the Earthlings, are becoming fewer and more precarious, just as the climate is being increasingly affected and destroyed by toxic emissions.
Your statement is absolutely correct because, in fact, it is as you say. It is explanatory to say that, in other words, it results that once a mental direction has been taken and firmly fixed, a construct of thought, a direction of learning, behavior, and everything in general that the human thinks of as good, positive, correct, as a creation-aligned lifestyle, humanity, righteousness, love, peace, freedom and justice, etc. has been worked out, effected, created, trained, brought about and achieved as a culmination point and behavior to the state of life behavior, very quickly becomes completely void again if conscious control and prevention fails. This is seen solely in terms of the external influences on the mentality schema part, which as a collective factor is influenceable and changeable. And the whole of this corresponds to the same factor as is inherent in us Pleiaren. Consequently, we too, like Earth humans, are susceptible to outside influences. Consequently, we must, as I have already explained to you in another conversation, protect ourselves from the very negative and destructive mental influences of Earth humans and must not cultivate any contacts with them. But such a prevention of contact among Earth humans themselves is not possible for them. Consequently, only the possibility of learning exists for them, namely with regard to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, and its behavioral implementation in daily life. So they must constantly orient themselves consciously, concentratedly and powerfully towards it, and must not allow themselves to be distracted from it. Otherwise, the negative external influences of the Earth's population on the factor of the mentality scheme part will tear away, invalidate, and destroy the goal of healthy, positive, and righteous behavior which they are striving for or have already achieved, and consequently, there will inevitably be a fall back into all the old mentality schemes and behavior. As a result, all the old bad values of unkindness, discord, lack of freedom, violence, falsehood, self-sacrifice, and lack of self-respect break through again, as do all other injustices and unrighteousness. Inevitably, the completely wrong old forms of thought and backslide into the foreground, whereby it must be fundamentally noted that a certain weakness of the intelligentum is also decisively involved, because the intelligentum is of enormous importance for intellect and rationality. This is because, depending on the volume of intelligentum, the measure for the general intellectual capacity is given, and thus also intellect and rationality are controlled. This also means that the ratio of the volume of intelligentum determines whether everything and anything is perceived, recognized, understood, processed correctly or incorrectly, and whether logical courses of action and behavior are then created and executed, as you yourself have often formulated in a similarly instructive manner. However, the whole thing has nothing to do with the nonsensical intelligentum quotient IQ tests, by which the intelligentum of Earth humans cannot be determined, but only their general knowledge and other education. This is not surprising because of the arrogance, ignorance, and incompetence of earthly psychologists who call themselves experts in psychology, but in reality they are not. In their autophilia, their self-love, they live in age-created false assertions and explanations which, as a result of short-sightedness, stupidity, ignorance, lack of talent, and lack of insight, have been factually established as knowledge and do not permit any further development in a matter of psychology. As usual, everything in this respect is done in such a way that the false findings are regarded and championed as the last word in wisdom, whereby these findings, however, have no substance whatsoever of real analytical findings, experiences, and also of effective knowledge. This is why earthly psychologists repeatedly make serious misjudgments, resulting in all kinds of harm to fellow human beings and the environment, up to and including evil violence, destruction, revenge, war, terror, and even murder. Furthermore, it is to be said that the earthly psychologists, who are still extremely ignorant of psychology, are absolutely incapable of determining and distinguishing the intelligentum, and that it is therefore impossible for them to recognize a valid definition of the intelligentum and to understand it. But if I have to go into further detail in my explanation as to what the fundamental causes are for a human being to deviate away when he or she has turned to the creational natural development of consciousness, and endeavored to orient his or her lifestyle and life conduct based on the creational natural laws, but then, however, falls away from it again and relapses into his or her old, creational contrary modes of thinking, feeling, acting, behaving, and disposition, be it after days, weeks, months, years, or after many decades, then this is done out of cowardice with regard to themselves. As a result, as before turning to that which is correct, progressive and valuable with regard to the personal development of consciousness and adherence to the creational laws, the old destructive disinterest in thoughts, feelings, actions, and behavior, etc., flares up again, and altogether everything that is evolutionary is disregarded. As a result, everything that is obstructive, harmful, wrong-headed, wrong-behaving, wrong-thinking, wrong-feeling, and wrongly influencing the psyche comes back with evil, uncontrollable force. So all the old creation-contrary things break through again and once more hinder the human beings with full force in their progress of consciousness. At the same time, he or she is not even able to remember how much. Better, their state of consciousness. Thought-feeling psyche was during the time when they followed their natural requirement for the development of consciousness. This was precisely when they detached themselves from their old consciousness evolutionless false living, which they then only suppressed from then on instead of properly dissolving, which therefore, because it continued to exist in their innermost being, fully reasserts itself again after their relapse into the old creationally contrary lifestyle and life conduct. In this respect, the intellect, rationality, and the intelligentum have an important part to play, for it is those that provide the reason for the failure of intellect and reason as a result of a weakness of intelligentum. This, however, has a negative effect on every clear and sensible thought with regard to an effort to learn and comprehend a creationally ordained, correct, and valuable wise of life and living. As a result of the weakness of the intelligentum, incorrect, non-valued thought, feeling, action, behavior patterns arise which again break through with violence and, in contrast to what was previously correct, bring to bear again to a much greater extent everything that was previously negative. As a result, the human being again lives contrary to all creational natural laws, is dissatisfied, and under certain circumstances becomes a believer in God again, or otherwise rises above all creational natural laws, loses their own identity, and goes along as a self-punishing coward in a life that is contrary to the laws of creation, dissatisfied and under certain circumstances severely psychologically impaired. This, while the human being, if he or she lives according to the creational natural laws, endeavors throughout their life to live out their lifestyle and conduct of life according to the creational laws with full strength, and in this respect, never to slacken in learning to expand their consciousness, even if any external negative influences and circumstances have a harassing and depressing effect on them. But if the human being allows himself or herself to be influenced by such external and negative influences and circumstances, of whatever kind they may be, then they deviate from the positive and good path they had once taken and followed, which then happens in the sense of a personal cowardice which they direct against themselves. This corresponds to a reprehensible pusillanimity and despondency, precisely a cowardice which punishes him or her with shame in themselves and makes it impossible for them to perceive their low value in terms of intellect, rationality, and intelligentum, or even to understand why they act contrary to consistency or contrary to logic. His or her state of lack of intellect, rationality, and intelligentum in this respect does not allow them to perceive the reality of life and its truth, neither within themselves nor outwardly to the environment and to their fellow human beings. Consequently, it is impossible for the human being in this situation to perceive and effectively grasp that he or she is untrustworthy, dishonorable, and disrespectful to themselves and within themselves, and makes himself or herself a weakling and a shirker before their own determinations, decisions, and fickle opinions. This, while he or she does not perceive that they also radiate the whole thing out to their fellow humans and unwillingly and ignorantly reveal themselves to them as cowards. This cowardice corresponds to an extremely negative quality by which the human being, as a result of lack of intelligentum, intellect, and rationality, as well as unconscious fear not recognized by him or her, allows them to be uncontrollably dominated and cannot exercise any power over it. But this results because the human being, in their old, self-wasting state, is unable to control himself or herself, withdraws pathetically, faint-heartedly and weak-willedly into themselves, and in cowardice goes along with all their negative dispositions and wrong conduct on the path of least resistance and despondency of life. A human being who acts in this wise lives unthinkingly without respect and regard for himself or herself and tends, on every conceivable negative, evil, bad and dangerous occasion, on every happening, in every situation and situation, which may endanger him or her materially in some wise or in life and limb, etc., to a personal use of violence which goes as far as hatred, terror, war, and murder, etc.
Contact Report 713.
Yes, because the Sonayer can now prove beyond doubt that all the incidents concerning the strange occurrences in your workroom, as well as the interference with your computer work, are caused by the enormous mass of religion-related energetic swinging waves and their self-dynamically acting activities. This fact, however, is not intelligent for believers in religion, as well as for knowledgeable scientists and researchers of any size of mind, reason, and intelligence. The earthly sciences, research forces, and humanistic psychology are absolutely ignorant with regard to religion-believing energetic swinging waves, their forces and frequencies, as well as with regard to their self-dynamically acting modes of action. The self-dynamic action manifests itself outwardly and can be recognized, made visible, and expressed as certain negative, malicious, and degenerated thoughts, feelings, actions, deeds, and other behaviors. The fact that everything other than what every belief in God and religion supposedly claims to bring about takes place ultimately manifests itself as a malicious and uncontrollable contradiction, not as peace, freedom, justice, love, and non-violence, etc., but as exactly the opposite, as unpeace, unfreedom, violence, and hatred. With regard to what has now been said, I must explain that I have to take up even more and also repeat some things several times, as I also have to enumerate further explanatory terms that can describe everything that is necessary, for which I will cite a number of relevant terms for understanding, as I have learnt them from your extensive use of language and which apply very precisely to what results in Earth humans who believe in God and religion when the impulses of their inner character break through. I will begin my enumeration with the evil disposition in relation to wickedness, which contains many other low aspects, such as shabbiness, baseness, impudence, wretchedness, and open or deceitful malice and lying. Further, slander is also to be mentioned, which carries abysmal selfishness, self-importance, selfishness, obstinacy, arrogance, hegemonic behavior, as well as self-love and egoism, from which also envy and from it deceitfulness, malice, hatred, reprehensibility, and revenge behavior arise, which trigger pathological impulses and in the last resort lead to acts of blood, killings, murders, wars, and terror activities. Further, I will now also mention other degenerations that arise from the whole of sectarian faith vibrations, which act in their own dynamic and have a malicious effect on Earth humans, because in their allegiance to faith they do not think for themselves and do not make their own decisions, and are therefore also without their own opinion with regard to acting freely according to their own responsibility. And this results especially when the believers in God and religion are suggestively incited to enmity and hatred against other human beings, groups and peoples, etc., by religious faith leaders, by any groups, associations, rulers, militaries, and governments. And in this respect, there is also the rule that warlike and terrorist acts, deeds, and other malicious behavior are demanded, which the believers in God and religion unhesitatingly, obediently, and willingly comply with. And they do this by disregarding all humanity, love, justice, and righteousness, without resistance to the orders and demands of the ringleaders in power, and by causing bloodbaths, massacres, and destruction through enormous degenerations, as they also commit countless killings, murders, and rapes without conscience and spread endless horrors. In addition to all that I have already listed of the degenerate, disastrous human unworthiness which I have named in certain terms, there are many others to be mentioned, such as gall, outrageousness, nastiness, spitefulness, meanness, common danger, deceitfulness and ugliness, despicableness and treacherousness. And in addition to these terms, there must also be mentioned infamy, devilishness, dogness, meanness, and insensitivity, meanness, wickedness, lustfulness for war and terror, perfidiousness, vileness, and abominableness, etc., which are deeply rooted in the inner character. These are called the evil, which are latent in the inner character of the religious believer, and which awaken negative and malignant impulses in certain events and situations, etc., which have a degenerating and malignant effect on the outside and cause much mischief. And this multiple mischief has already developed before primeval times, when in a natural way the life forms quarreled and fought over their food and mating, as has remained completely natural up to the present day in the world of free nature with the majority of many living beings. Only a few species of life forms, as a result of their innate somewhat higher capacity for development, have arrived at modes of behavior by which they have deviated in a slight way from this law of nature and have become more peaceful, less envious of food, and less averse to quarreling and fighting. The early life forms, which in course of time ultimately evolved into the human form, were at early times quarreling, fighting, and violent among themselves in regard to food and mating in order to secure for themselves all that they needed. As the development of the human beings as a life form progressed, evolution also brought about the first important factors in the development of reason, whereby the fighting and struggling for food and mating could be carried out more and more successfully and efficiently. This is what happened with the early life forms that developed into Earth humans, and will also be maintained by the present and all future generations of Earth humans. Consequently, they will, as at all times before, also act today, tomorrow, and in the future as the laws of nature dictate, according to which they will also in the future always fight and struggle for their food and mating, if this becomes necessary for their self-preservation through any events, situations and occurrences, etc. But since they possess intellect, reason, and intelligence, they apply these values and unvalues to their benefit, according to all their early experiences, which are created in their inner character being and are also latently present today and tomorrow as malignant degenerations. The consequence is, and will always be, if Earth humans do not make an effort on their own, initiative to combat all these degenerations lurking in their inner character being and to dissolve them, that all degenerations and all evils of all kinds unworthy of human beings will go on endlessly into the future with coercion and malignant violence. And the most important reason for this is given by every delusion of every form, because every belief, be it in the form of a delusion of God, a philosophy, ideology, or worldview, which corresponds to a delusion of religion, is alien to every reality and truth. Consequently, every faith is not fundamentally grounded in the absolute certainty and irrefutability of factuality, truthfulness, and its real authenticity. The living beings of that time, which were still wild beings, and not to be equated with ape beings, as Charles Darwin tried to prove as Earth human ancestors through his fraudulent machinations by working on ape bones with a file, in the course of time fell into all conceivable degenerations, up to killing and murdering. In addition, ever larger groups also led to ever nastier conflicts, which resulted in ever more vicious and degenerating violence among themselves, and were fought out early on with primitive objects as fighting implements and weapons. This corresponds to a fact which has occurred not only among the nascent Earth humans, but throughout the universe on all worlds, and which also continues to take place in this way, for this has been the case everywhere where living beings of all kinds have arisen on any world. But this is also the way in which life forms are constantly evolving throughout the universe, as it will also continue to do in all future time, when the ratio develops in living beings capable of it. The whole thing also applies to all humanoid life forms. to human beings and human-like beings, as well as to life forms which are of a completely different kind from human beings, but all of which are fundamentally peaceful, and only become unpeaceful and hostile to each other when the urge for food and mating begins to take effect. This then gives rise to all the evils of quarreling and fighting, up to and including killing. Depending on the possibility of evolutionary development in relation to instinctive behavior or a form of intellect, the types of natural instinct for self-preservation, which is naturally given, are then followed. If, however, the ratio develops in a life form, it leads to all kinds of degenerations and evils. If no conscious control is exercised over the developing ratio, consequently, everything is deposited in the inner developing character being, and from there erupts at every opportunity or situation or impulse. And the more highly developed the ratio function, and with it also the consciousness function, the more perfidiously they can fall into malignant degenerations with regard to thoughts and feelings, actions, deeds, and modes of behavior, such as these have in principle already arisen from the beginnings of the becoming of life forms, but which can be devised and implemented even more perfidiously by the ratio. This is also the case with Earth humans and their thoughts, behavior, actions, and deeds, against which, however, they can defend themselves if they make an effort and bring under control their entire malignant, quarrelsome, and combative modes of thought, feeling, and behavior adopted in the early days of their becoming in order to become human beings in the truest sense of the term. This, however, is prevented in them by their delusion, which arose in their early days of their process of development into human life forms, as it arises everywhere in the universe from the development of ratiocination in life forms capable of it, through some observation and conceit concerning something which, as a result of false, erroneous assumptions, thoughts, and feelings, was considered to be a higher being above all. This led to an unnatural, worshipful behavior and delusion with regard to what was observed and wrongly defined, and from this the whole thing developed into a structure of belief, as is predetermined by the free ability to interpret, not only in Earth humans from the beginning and time of their existence, but also universally in all human, human-like, and human-unlike life forms, which are capable of a ratio-moderate evolution, are capable of it, and develop further in this respect. From this, in the course of time, ever greater conflicts developed between the early Earth human groupings, which then formed themselves into nations, and which subsequently built up fighting forces, up to organized militaries equipped with deadly and destructive military means. From this, from time immemorial, conventional wars and bloody terrorism inevitably arose again and again, whereby finally, in modern times, the madness of all the greatest warlike crimes and irresponsibilities of mankind that have ever taken place arose, namely the creation of atomic fission and finally the atomic war crimes, which have far surpassed by far all the terrible atrocities and crimes of all kinds that have taken place up to then, and also all other Earth humans. It will be, however, that these war crimes and irresponsibilities of humanity will also continue to threaten and still bring a great deal of disaster upon Earth humans. This is because the majority of all rulers, as well as the majority of the peoples in bondage to them, in their obsession with power and inability to recognize, understand, comprehend, and fulfill the truly natural creative and its laws, leave everything unconsidered. In this way, however, they criminally violate and act against the natural creative reality and its truth, whereby they keep all mischief rampant and constantly promote it. Thus, not only peace, freedom, and justice are more and more and more and more invalidated, but also every correct administration of justice, as well as every possibility of teaching Earth humans. This is especially true with regard to opposing the false doctrines of faith and religion, which deceive their believers and prevent them from becoming sensible and thinking for themselves, with speeches such as God alone will judge, and prayers will be heard by God, and will help. This is so that the Earth humans can learn to direct everything on their own initiative, to think for themselves, to investigate, to decide for themselves and to act on their own responsibility, in order to sort out everything evil and degenerate in their own inner character being, and to change it for the better, and thus to true human existence. All that which is degenerate and malignant, as I have described and explained it, and which anchored itself in the inner character of all Earth humans ages ago, is since then unconsciously latent for them, but does not openly appear outwardly, and cannot also be directly visible or otherwise comprehensible. Without being perceived, it quietly dawns in the inner character being and is depressed by every sectarian, erroneous and confused belief in something better and good, and in particular by every delusion of God and religion which deludes the believing earth human being that a God, who is in every case imaginary and delusional, will judge and bring about everything good, better, positive and correct, such as peace, freedom, love and justice, etc. This confused and foolish belief alone, which impairs the intellect and reason, as a result of impaired or fundamentally lacking intelligence, makes it impossible for believers of all kinds, religious or otherwise, to form clear thoughts and to direct them towards the effective, real reality and its sole truth. This fact is founded in an earth humanly invented, insidious, wicked delusion of faith, by which all believers in God and religion are led astray and prevented from exercising their personal responsibility towards their natural, creation-just moral development, shaping of life and conduct of life, in that an all-judging imaginary deity is made to appear to them through delusions of faith. Natural creative moral development is understood to be those processes that lead to the internalization of natural creative norms and values, whereby these rules are then also to be adhered to in every situation that arises, even when there is a temptation to break them or resistance to them is great, tempting, and there is also no fear of punishment. In principle, since time immemorial, everything degenerate and malignant in earth humans has lurked in the inner being of character, in order to break through to the outside at the right time through some event, situation, or profound thought-emotional impulse, and to wreak havoc and destruction. The erroneous religious teachings and the delusion of faith in earth humans are not broken as a result of the unreasonableness caused by faith, but are constantly strengthened to the contrary, misleadingly by lies and deceit. This is done by preachers of all religions, who, by means of lies and fanciful stories, make the believers in the delusion of God believe in an allegedly all-good God, a Holy Spirit or some saint, through whom the abysmal degeneracy and evil in the inner character of earth humans can be changed into something better, good and positive if he, God, the Holy Spirit, or saint, etc., is only unquestioningly, piously, and positively changed, is only implored unquestioningly, piously, and submissively, humbly, believed in and worshipped with full devotion. The reality and truth is that there never was an omnipotent God who would have created worlds, celestial bodies, living beings, and the universe, for such a God, who never existed and never will exist, corresponds to a mad, confused imagination and delusional conceits of beings who were and are human, human-like, and non-human. Deities only exist among earth humans and other like or similar life forms who call themselves God and elevate, themselves to deities in order to elevate themselves above the masses of their populations and to megalomaniacally want to be something special and higher. In this way, the same phenomenon arises as with rulers and the rich, who believe themselves to be of greater value and above the normal population, if they have many material goods and financial resources or carry titles such as president, clergyman, doctor, professor, king, leader or emperor, etc. But with regard to God Creator, it is undoubtedly certain that in truth, only the creation universal consciousness was and is the creation of all existence, which holds everything in itself, created, exists, evolves, and creates all energies and their powers. And before this all-time for the God delusion believers incomprehensible and immeasurable greatness creation, the earth humans with their deviant God delusion do not shrink from denying it, but raise above it and all its existence imaginary deities which they worship, implore, and thereby humiliate and deny themselves as independent life-form human beings. In their pathological delusion of God, they implement their sectarian delusion of lies and deceit in such a way that they deny the truthful creation of universal consciousness. And this is done by the God-believing earth humans of all religions and their sects, who worship and glorify an imaginary God creator as the author of all existence. This is also the case with all those earth humans who adhere to philosophies, ideologies, worldviews, atheism, and other confessions, points of view, meanings, and assumptions which effectively correspond to nothing other than beliefs and thus imaginations, which, however, have nothing to do with the real reality and incontrovertible truth of the existence of creation universal consciousness, because all their thoughts, suppositions, and assumptions are not based on effective reality and its only truth, but on erroneous, confused, and faith-based hypotheses. And the fact is that various philosophies, ideologies, worldviews, and other creeds are in some way faith-based on a deity and are therefore unreal and offer no possibility whatsoever of finding any way to effective reality and truth, but that this has to be done solely by earth humans, each one for himself alone, moreover consciously and very laboriously through his own initiative, as you teach this as a result of your mission and as you also convey it to earth humans through the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life. But earth humans' delusion of God and religious belief of every kind prevent them, as believers in God and religion, from being able to perceive reality and its real truth, or, as a result of the fear of divine punishment persuaded into them by the misguided teachings of religion, from daring to turn away from their allegiance to faith. Due to the fundamentally false religious misguided teachings, they are indeed beings who are actually responsible for the delusion suggested to them by religious representatives, because they have fallen prey to it as a result of ignorance and misguidance, but they cannot be condemned for this error and cannot be made liable to prosecution. And this is so because every learning in every respect, and thus also in relation to effective reality and its real truth, involves an error that must be recognized, considered, analyzed, and remedied, by which only the reality and its truth can be followed. It is precisely this creative process of gaining knowledge, following it and gaining the correctness of life that you teach, but through the religious delusion, which is as a rule already thoughtlessly imposed and implanted in earth humans as children by their parents and relatives, and then also irresponsibly by the religious representatives, they become helpless, obedient, and self-denying beings with regard to their self-thinking, their self-determination, self-decision, and their self-action in complete self-responsibility. due to the delusion of God and religion suggested to them, as well as the fear of divine punishment persuaded into them if they turn away from their faith. They are not able to recognize and therefore not able to understand the effective reality and truth. Consequently, they also do not make an effort to question the delusion of faith and the religious lies suggested to them. Therefore, in terms of their faith, they are also confusedly oriented towards placing their imaginary God and his alleged actions and work, as well as his alleged decisions, in the foreground in all things, in a confused and pathologically believing false hope. God will sort it out. Because the majority of Earth humans are delusional about God and religion, they also do not know that these regimes, which burst forth from the inner depths of the personalities of the believers in God and religion, inevitably lead to correspondingly degenerate thoughts, feelings, actions, and deeds, as a result of which countless degenerations and monstrosities in contempt of life and human beings take place throughout the world, which make a mockery of any description. All earthly scientists and researchers have neither an inkling nor any knowledge of the vibrations of faith which, through their self-dynamic activity, have brought terrible disaster upon Earth humans since time immemorial, although this also continues to happen unabated. Neither the majority of the general believers in God and the delusion of religion, nor the scientists and researchers, who as a rule are also afflicted by the sectarianism of faith, are able to grasp the reality and truth of the swinging waves of the delusion of faith and their self-dynamic activities through their intellect, nor are they able to recognize them through sensual perception. Consequently, they are absolutely ignorant in this respect, for whom, on the one hand, everything is inexplicable and incomprehensible, but which, on the other hand, in their narrow-mindedness and arrogance, drives them to reject and doubt the correctness and truth of the effective existence of the dangerous religious delusional vibrations. This is precisely due to their ignorance of the element of faith vibration, which is completely alien and unknown to them as an element of research. And all this is the reason why you should spread widely among Earth humans all that I am explaining in this respect today, although you must be clearly aware from the outset that you are therefore again calling adversaries onto the scene through unreason, hatred, and know-it-all attitude. And as always, they will also call you a fraud, a liar, a charlatan, a false prophet, an unbeliever, a heretic, and in many other malicious ways, and threaten you. This, however, will be as inevitable as all attacks of every kind and nature, as they have always appeared. For the power of the delusions of faith and their self-dynamic activities seduce all those unrighteous believers in God and religion who are unable to exercise any control over themselves, and who, as a result of their faith, suffer from a lack of use of intellect, reason, and intelligence. And this will cause them to once again turn against you and against the spreading of the truth, and will try to harm you, to undermine the truth and not let it reach the consciousness of Earth humans.
You really do not give me much pleasure, dear friend, for I can vividly imagine what may result if I spread your speech throughout the world. It will also be of no use to me that I have no personal objection to the believers in God and religion as human beings. I always behave correctly towards them, and therefore do not attack them because of their delusion, just as I would never speak to them about their faith, because their imagination is their personal matter alone. What I do is only to openly write, speak and spread the truth with regard to the pathological religious delusions, or the belief in God and religion, precisely what is at stake in every belief in God and every religious belief. But this is always in connection with the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and thus with the mission that is to be spread and fulfilled. The fact of the matter is that it must be said and made clear that everything that has occurred in all peoples since time immemorial through degenerate and malicious machinations, such as killing, murder, wars and terrorism, criminality, etc., as well as through crimes of all imaginable kinds, is also occurring at present or in the present time worldwide in general among all existing peoples, and is also being carried into the future in equal measure. The indisputable fact is that all delusions of God and thus all delusions of religious faith, which also unites all those sects, philosophies, ideologies and worldviews, etc., which are oriented towards an assumption of and belief in a higher might, have always brought the most evil calamities upon the humanity of the earth, and are also doing so at present, and continue to do so. And in such a horrible and inhuman way, as everything completely degenerate in human terms was done by the Inquisition, as also by the 3 world wars and all other wars of all kinds, which were already commonplace in ancient times among all peoples, so it continues unchecked, and worse the greater the overpopulation becomes. The delusion of God, or rather the delusion of religion of all believers, contributes the most to the whole in terms of discord, lack of freedom, injustice, lack of understanding, unreason, hatred, murder and manslaughter, strife, war, addictions, vice, criminality and crime, etc. This is also the case with all other religions. But this is also the case with all other religious, atheistic, philosophical, military, ideological, hegemonic, and worldly delusions of faith. All forms of faith of any kind are rejecting of the real existing reality and its incontrovertible truth. Consequently, the whole is not perceived, and in its all-time presentness is in no way recognized and also not understood. All forms of delusion of earthlings of all ages, of both sexes and of all professions, also regardless of whether they are rich or poor, prevent all rational and rational thinking and the conscious perception, grasping, understanding and the following, acting and implementing of all necessities in relation to the real reality and the given and unchangeable truth that exists only in this reality. In addition, all beliefs of any kind prevent any real and truthful knowledge in relation to the fact that it is also the constantly rapidly growing and ever more destructive overpopulation that, through its reality and truth, disregarding machinations of every conceivable kind, does not allow any insight to arise in the believing earthlings with regard to the reality of reality and its truth, thus also not with regard to the actual terrible, destructive, and murderous war, terror, and other life-despising world events. Thus, it is not perceived, not recognized, and not understood that overpopulation alone is to blame for all the catastrophes and destructions raging around the world, due to the degenerate machinations of all kinds that it carries out and continues to push forward. All believers in God and religion, as well as all believers in philosophies, politics, ideologies, atheism, worldviews, and other core convictions of all kinds, are without exception more or less addicted to a profound sectarianism, as are all other believers of all kinds. It is irrelevant whether they are simple believers in imagination or obedient believers in suggestion, or whether they are simply brain amputees who have unthinkingly committed themselves as unquestioning followers of any faith. This, however, refers to the majority of Earth humans who close their eyes and senses to all visible and indisputable reality, its truth and everything that is undoubtedly effective from it, and who unthinkingly endorse everything that is steeped in delusion without thinking about it realistically. And this is so because, as a result of his laziness, indifference, carelessness, and lack of interest, any initiative of his own towards the perception of real reality and truth and its investigation is blunted as a result of influences of faith, which make him believe that his faith in God and God will regulate and judge everything. And this is only one of the reasons why people of all kinds who are addicted to faith disregard reality and its truth, and only live mentally and self-referentially into the day and night, and can use neither reason, rationality, nor intelligence. It is also to be noted that the majority of all believers of all persuasions suffer from a deficient or even completely absent ability to think logically. In this respect, it is irrelevant whether these believers in God are simple, ignorant, and not particularly educated people, or academic title wielders who live under the delusion that with an academic degree as a doctor, etc., or as a president, professor, general, chancellor, head of state, or whatever, they must elevate themselves above the common citizenry and are worth more than them. In their delusion of faith, however, they are all more or less equally infatuated with their faith, and are in bondage to every religious doctrinaire lie and deception, believing and willfully surrendering to it, whereby they take everything that corresponds to their delusion of faith at face value, imagining it to be fact and vehemently advocating and defending it to the point of quarreling, enmity, blazing hatred, murder, manslaughter, war, and malicious terrorism. The whole thing with the delusion of God and the delusion of religion, as with every other faith, has many evil sides, because everything does not simply remain in the earthlings themselves, who are afflicted with the delusion of faith, but it leads them during the time of their delusion in such a way into error and into sectarian, slave-like dependence on the delusion of faith that they also influence their fellow human beings by recruiting followers. In this way, faithfulness is promoted throughout the world, especially among children by parents, siblings, and relatives, as well as by schools, institutions, missionaries, and highly sectarian female and male lay preachers and soul catchers on television and at public soul-catching events. In this respect, not only irresponsible bare sectarians are up to mischief on the internet and on television, such as the faith-delusional sect fanatic Joyce Meyer and her followers on the DMX channel, etc., but also individual terrorists and small terror cells of various faiths. Dictatorial and religiously insane state powers, such as Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, and Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, etc., also wreak havoc and justify everything with their insane belief in God, as is also the case with large terrorist organizations such as IS or Islamist State. And everything has always taken place in the name of a religious belief, and under the alleged will and protection of a god, clergy or field clergy, whereby murder, torture, manslaughter, robbery, rape, slavery, servitude, and war with jubilant cries were and are in the foreground. In all states, which early on and up to the present time made use of the God delusion and employed it for the purpose of wars of faith, religion and sectarian wars, the God delusion has always served, and this is still the case today, to animate the war servants, soldiers and the peoples for murder and manslaughter in the name of God and his protection against neighboring countries, enemies and people of other faiths, etc. Therefore, delusional faith in God and the corresponding delusional religions and sects were and are not only a means of propaganda, but specifically a means for lying, deceitful religious sectarian machinations and promises in war, as well as also a way of coercion to force people of other faiths into the political and religious dependency of the victors through fighting and bloodshed. In addition to all the murderous, subjugating, coercive and warlike machinations that arose out of the delusion of God and religion, arose thousands of years ago and have since brought and continue to bring endless misery, suffering, hardship, and disaster to the whole earth and its humanity, there have existed and continue to exist other malignant forces of the same nature. So, just as from time immemorial the delusional believers in God practiced wars of faith and religion, and always in accordance with their delusional belief in God, so did others, namely believers in philosophies, ideologies, and worldviews, etc., as was also the case with various state powers, and is also still the case today. The belief in God's delusion therefore also served and still serves the warring states to motivate their own military and people, especially the soldiers who are called upon to fight, and who participate by virtue of correspondingly compulsory state laws. The personal sacrifice of one's own death through the act of war into which the soldiers and peoples are forced is usually equated with a religious sacrifice, and thus as an adjunct to the belief in God, with religious benefits being promised to the combatants in particular. The fact is that throughout the ages, warmongering irresponsible state powers and their slimy accomplices, namely religious bosses and other slimy delusional rabble, have expected a greater willingness on the part of soldiers and peoples who believe in God's delusion to fight and wage war. In addition to this, the willingness and acceptance of material losses is demanded from the war and terror inciting state powers and the military leadership, such as first and foremost material disadvantages in relation to a drastic shortage of food and other essentials, etc., but also the loss of one's own houses, the loss of the right to live, 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 but also the loss of one's own houses, possessions, land and property, as well as horrendous increases in levies for war costs, and also higher taxes. And all this has always been the case, so also with the Christian Crusades, Crusaders, and with all the criminal religious wars in various countries. Also to be mentioned are the bloody battles for God and Islam jihad, along with many other religious massacres, as well as such degenerations in Switzerland, such as the two Capellar Wars, of which I still know the following from my school days with regard to Swiss history, and have also read up on some of it. The First and Second Capellar Wars in Switzerland were wars between Reformed evangelical, Protestant, and Catholic delusional believers, which means that these armed conflicts were nothing other than delusions of faith and religious wars between two different Christian delusions of faith, which arose as a result of different delusions of faith, various rituals and cult acts, as well as practices with regard to the leadership and behavior of the religious leaders and their way of life, etc.
Explanation of the terms Protestant and Evangelical. The term Protestant refers to the two large Christian churches, but this was not always the case, because the term Protestant was already used before the Reformation, whereby it originally meant concerning the gospel or according to the gospel, and therefore Martin Luther also spoke of Protestant in this sense, and did not mean the denomination of a particular church.
The term Protestant or Protestants can be traced back to the protestation at the Diet of Speyer in 1529, when the Protestant estates protested against the repeal of an older Diet resolution that promised legal security in the German Empire to those countries where the Reformation had been introduced, whereby the protesting estates invoked the freedom of faith of the individual believer. The First Capel War took place in 1529 between Reformed Protestant and Catholic places, whereby the starting point of this war between the old and new faith Christians of various places in the Confederation was a religious dispute that was fundamentally based on the famous 95 Theses of Martin Luther, a monk and vicar general of the Augustinian hermits, and which gave rise to the Reformation and the division of Christianity. This was after Luther in 1517 denounced publicly and among the clergy the common practices concerning the Roman Catholic Church, and especially its sale of indulgences, which was based on the fact that indulgences could be bought from the Catholic Church by God-believing earthlings, through which the faithful could supposedly buy themselves free of their sins. He called the Pope a hypocrite, and also denounced the fact that Catholic priests gave out or sold forgiveness of sins and grace for sins in small bites, granting absolution or absolution from sins depending on how much a believer had paid beforehand. Luther rebelled against this and stressed that a Christian should not be judged by his performance of a financial indulgence, because this did not correspond to Christian freedom, etc. And furthermore, no special works had to be performed in order to attain beatitude, which in Catholicism is fantasized and lied about as perfection in the kingdom of God and eternal contemplation of God. Martin Luther's 95 Theses a thesis corresponds to an assuring judgment, which can also be interpreted as conjecture, speculation, assumption or hypothesis, as poking around in the fog, as well as an assertion that serves as a starting point for further argumentation, are said to have been written by him at 12 like noon on the 31st of October 1517. However, this does not correspond to the actual truth, but to a stupid conspiracy theory that was invented by a fanatically delusional Luther follower for the purpose of the great Luther courage, in order to give Luther a high nimbus or a special reputation and glamorous fame, and thereby also to elevate his Reformation. This story sounds really good, but the thing about the nailing of the 95 Theses to the door of the castle church is not true, because the whole thing is effectively a lie and only corresponds to a fairy tale, with which the people were to be made to believe that the criticism raised by Martin Luther against the Pope and the Catholic Church in general was not only brought to the people orally, but also in writing, whereby, what a contradiction, the common people at that time were still largely ignorant of reading and writing. What is clear, however, is that the alleged nailing of the 95 Theses to the castle church door by Luther never took place, and that this has been clearly clarified, although nothing needs to be said about how and why. The demand of Martin Luther, the Augustinian monk from Wittenberg, that the church must be renewed, as well as his criticism of the Pope, the Catholic Church and the sale of indulgences, etc. He starts with the clergy, and thus also his open accusation that the Pope needed vast amounts of money for his dissolute life in the Vatican, which Martin Luther insulted as a stronghold of anti-Christianity, and therefore cultivated the sale of indulgences in a particularly profitable way. He did this by instructing the Catholic priesthood to sell indulgences in a stricter manner to the delusional, stupid Catholic Christian people, so that His Highest Catholic Eminence, Pope Leo X Wikipedia, Pope Leo X, born as Giovanni de' Medici, 11th December 1475 in Florence, plus 1st December 1521 in Rome, could live in glory and pleasure, and indulge in his costly feasts, etc., and fornication. A well-known fact, as it was also common to other popes before him and also to various successors after him, whereby in this respect the whole thing also applied and still applies to various types of cardinals and simple clergy, and many sad clerical figures or consecrated clergy of the Roman Catholic Church. And the whole thing in this respect is not only related to papal, cardinal and spiritual clerical fornication with willing prostitutes bought for this purpose, but the Vatican also does not let itself down in terms of profits, this apart from the exploitation of the faithful, because it also furnishes its financial assets with brothels. But that is not all, because pedophilia, and also the sexual abuse of children and adolescents, is very widespread worldwide, especially among the Roman Catholic clergy, from the lowest to the highest. And all this has been happening since the time when about 2,000 years ago the herald Emmanuel taught the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life in Palestine, which his disciples and people made into a basic religion as a result of misunderstanding and misinterpretation, from which the Christian delusion, and thus ultimately the entire Christian God delusion and religion delusion emerged, which today comprise about 2.3 billion God delusion believers. This had to be made clear once, but now the religious delusion conflict of the two Capel Wars is to be elaborated a little, because I digressed from it because of Martin Luther. The conflict or First Capeller War began in 1529, but ended without actual fighting. Instead, with a reconciliation dinner near the village of Capel am Albis in the canton of Zurich, where a milk soup was made that was recorded in the Swiss Chronicle as Capeller Milchsuppe. Capel am Albis was already inhabited in the Bronze Age, and later there was also a Roman estate there, but there is certainly something to be found on Wikipedia on the internet regarding this place, which I will add to my explanations when I have found something.
A swinging wave is not simply limited to a single vibration, but contains two dimensions within itself, which is still completely or at least partially unknown to the earthly scientists who deal with this subject. Every swinging wave has two levels, a positive and a negative one, each of which can have corresponding effects or can potentially cause something. So swinging waves are also to be considered in this way as multidimensional energies with corresponding forces, because they have both a negative and a positive level or dimension, both of which produce their effects, although earthly scientists have not yet gained any knowledge in this respect. But in order to explain the whole thing in a simple way, about which I too have been instructed by the Sonairon, because everything is new even to us Plearan, I can say the following about it. A swinging wave corresponds to an information transmitting system that originates from a basic source of information, whereby the information vibrating in it is transmitted via the swinging channel or the swinging carrier, which finally reaches a receiver and has its effect on him. From a purely electronic point of view, this means that through the swinging waves, which correspond to a certain frequency or dimension or level with a specifically determined number of oscillations, a message or an impulse is transmitted, which triggers a certain target reaction, which can be, for example, in a material technical sense, the starting up of an apparatus, an instrument, an igniter, a device, or a machine, etc. However, as far as the sectarian swinging waves are concerned, which emanate from believers in God or religion and spread around the earth, partly positively but mainly as very strong negative and malicious energy like a spherical screen, the Sonairon could not find a centered transmitter in this respect. This is because no such transmitter exists, but the sectarian faith energy swinging waves are emitted by each individual human being who believes in God or religion, or is delusional about religion, directly through his or her personal consciousness, and enter the spherical swinging screen of sectarian energy that encompasses the earth and strengthen it more and more. These sectarian swinging waves of belief, which effectively correspond to positive and negative impulses, are such that they work independently according to their energy and their power, so that on the one hand positive in a weak way, and consequently good and positive only to a lesser extent, come out of it, whereby this little good and positive can however also have an extremely negative, malicious, and degenerating effect. And this happens, for example, with regard to a fanaticism of faith or through a profound faith bias, which in any case corresponds to an adherence to faith and prevents any personal formation of opinion, but from this can also arise terrible and life-hostile acts of violence with regard to life and limb against fellow human beings. And this corresponds to a fact which results, for example, from a hatred of people of other faiths, but also from the devil's service mania, as this resulted from the Inquisition. But it is especially the many other forms of religious delusion that lead to murder, wars, and terrorism, and thus to torture, human massacres, unpeace, unfreedom, unrighteousness, dishonor, lack of dignity and injustice, as well as to immense crimes against humanity and destruction, and so on. On the other hand, however, all the above-mentioned positive things and their fanatical degenerations are opposed by the fundamentally negative and evil, which dominates the positive and even its positive degenerations immensely strongly and powerfully. This, however, is deeply anchored in the human beings who believe in the delusion of God and is not consciously perceived by them, but only when a certain thought, feeling, impulse, or an event, a situation, some special occurrence, or an external suggestion comes to the fore. But it can also be, for example, a self-preservation instinctual situation, or hatred, a difference of opinion, a quarrel, damage or loss suffered, etc., through which the instinctive and sectarian malignant degenerations latent in the believer's inner character come to the outbreak and cause extremely evil mischief. Earth humans are influenced and compelled by every kind of belief alien to reality and truth, whether it be related to a delusion of God, religion, philosophy, worldview, or other ideological delusion, to a morbid conceit, and thus to delusion through external and personal own suggestive influences. This inevitably results in a turning away from the real reality and its truth, contrary to reason, rationality, and intelligence. This takes place through a delusion-conditioned compulsion, which allows Earth humans to direct their entire consciousness, thought-feeling world only towards delusion, whereby all naturally creatively given incontestable and infallible truthfulness, and the correctness of the demonstrable certainty of the truth of reality is completely suppressed and rendered useless. And the consequence of this is that all the evil and degeneracy latent in the inner character of Earth humans is not consciously combated by thought-feeling, is not changed for the better, and is not dissolved, but continues to exist and, at every suitable impulse, occasion, or situation, etc., breaks out into the outside world and creates mischief. This means that every delusional Earth human being is like a time bomb that can explode at any time and cause catastrophes and all kinds of mischief. The effectiveness of the Earth humans is that only an infinitesimal number of individual persons are able to control themselves in such a way that they can keep and restrain themselves from malignant degenerations. This, while on the other hand, not only individual persons but also groups and large associations of the believing mass of the Earth's population are absolutely capable of using violence against fellow human beings and even killing their own kind, and they do so. And in this fact is also founded the truth that the majority of Earth humans, precisely the majority of the great mass of the population of delusional believers or religious believers of every kind, repeatedly, contrary to their denying assertions and affirmations in this respect, harbor thoughts and feelings of harming their enemies and fellow human beings as a result of hatred, discord, and all the malignancies and degenerations that have been mothballed in their inner character since time immemorial. Their thoughts and feelings go so far that they create ugly and malicious thought forms within themselves, which cause them to wish to meet their enemies and human beings with evil violence, to torture, torment, and even kill them. And when these desires break through, Earth humans know very well what they are doing in terms of evil and degeneracy, even though they fall into an emotional state of ecstasy, into a particularly intense psychic state of emergency. And such states, as I also repeatedly explain, are brought about as a result of particular events, situations and moments of self-preservation, as well as by thought feelings, and uncontrollably lead to dramatic changes of consciousness, state, and behavior. If malignities and degenerations break out in Earth humans, then it must be understood that these forms of degeneration should no longer exist in life forms endowed with understanding, reason, and intelligence, which already naturally and creatively exhibit a somewhat higher evolution, such as Earth humans, but should have been fought and abolished at an early stage, which, however, has never been done in all human beings, human-like and human-unlike, despite understanding, and will also not be done for a long time to come. And consequently the degenerate and malignant will continue to exist throughout the universe through various human forms, human-like, and human-unlike life forms. This, however, can one day become a risky doom for Earth humans, namely through the stupidity and irresponsibility committed by earthly researchers and scientists, namely with the SETI project Cyclops, or Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And such a fate can befall all Earth humans if official contact with unpeaceful Earth foreigners should one day occur. An attempt at contact which was started unreasonably and recklessly by the search for extraterrestrials, and which under certain circumstances can bring not only great horrors, etc., but ultimately also a nasty end to all Earth human existence.
Wikipedia, Messages to Extraterrestrials. The term messages to extraterrestrials is used to describe various projects that aim to actively, consciously, and in a controlled manner send or pass on information about Earth, nature, and humanity to possible extraterrestrials. The English terms METI, Messaging to Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and active SETI are also often used. Perhaps the most famous projects are the Voyager Golden Records, the two gold-plated data discs with images and sound recordings, and the Pioneer plaques. In addition to these deliberate but untargeted messages, messages are repeatedly sent via radio transmitters to promising star areas. However, researchers such as astrophysicist Stephen Hawking and David Brin speculate that messages to extraterrestrials could also be associated with considerable risks. There are plans for planetary defense. The San Marino scale was created to assess the risk of a transmitted signal. According to the 10-level scale, the Arecibo message sent in 1974 would be level 8.
The malignant and degenerate nature of Earth humans mothballs unabatedly and endlessly in their inner character being, and this until it is clearly and consciously combated and neutralized on its own initiative through understanding, reason, and intelligence. What was normal in primeval times as a natural creative law of nature in terms of evolution and life support as well as reproduction, and which was expressed in lower life forms and in terms of lack of understanding, reason, and intelligence, and has been preserved until all time to come, such as quarreling and fighting over food and mating, should and must be brought to an end and adapted to evolution in the case of a development of ratio. If, then, higher levels of understanding, reason, and intelligence develop, as is the case with Earth humans and all human beings and human-like beings and human-like beings in the universe, then the natural creative law of higher evolution is also to be followed, which is no longer directed towards strife, struggle, violence, and coercion, but towards peace, freedom, righteousness, and justice, as well as towards nurture and care and so on. Earth humans, however, have not adhered to this since time immemorial, as is also the case throughout the universe wherever life forms evolve that exhibit a ratio. But since time immemorial this has led to all evil and degeneracy, which has taken root in the inner character of life forms endowed with reason and intelligence, and has led to all the horrors and dreadfulness which have always resulted and will continue to result, even among Earth humans, if they do not free themselves from it. Seen from the point of view of evolution, and thus also in the sense which my explanations and statements contain, it results that everything appears as normal and expedient, which it actually is, if it is viewed from the natural creative side in relation to the unalterable laws of nature. These laws of nature, however, are permanently oriented only to the behavior of all life forms that are not subordinated to a higher ratio evolution or a higher reason, as this, on the contrary, applies to the life forms of human beings as well as human equals, human-like, and other beings that are capable of higher evolution according to their intellect, their reason, and their intelligence. All lower life forms, which are not classified as capable of a higher evolution of ratio evolution, and therefore not of an evolution of mind, reason, and intelligence, remain non-evolutionary for the time of their existence with regard to mind, reason, and intelligence. This is also the case when life forms of this kind develop an ability to learn certain things and behaviors, and are capable of instinct, intellect, and profound psychic impulses. And now, when I address these facts, I cannot avoid some significant and explanatory remarks because Earth humans are ignorant in this matter on the one hand, and moreover have fallen prey to false assumptions, judgments, and assertions. On the one hand, contrary to all the Earth-human false assumptions, assertions, false doctrines, and hitherto inconclusive research by scientists, it is to be said that the life forms animals, which are exclusively mammalian creatures and a class of life forms with a spinal column in their backs, possess the capacity of a faculty of cognition which manifests itself through visual, acoustic, physical, and sentient perceptions. This includes, above all, mammals such as dogs, cats, horses, cattle, rabbits and mice, as well as whales and dolphins, which, from a subjective psychological point of view, have values and behavioral patterns, etc. It is true that fish, birds, reptiles, and amphibians also have dorsal vertebrae, but these correspond to their own genera and species, which are not to be classified under mammalian creatures and thus not under animals, but solely according to their special genus and species, as is also the case with respect to the creatures and insects and beetles, etc. Each life form corresponds to its own genus or species, and in this respect is to be designated only as such, but not simply generally as an animal, because such a thing corresponds to a mammalian creature, whereas a comprehensive designation for all genera and species can only be living beings or life forms. The use of the term animal in relation to all life forms is regrettable and wrong, which is unfortunately the result of Earth humans' still deficient definition of logical judgments, interpretations, and determinations. Contrary to all the false assumptions and assessments made by Earth humans concerning the basic components of animals and various creatures with regard to their instinctive intellect, etc., it is to be said that these life forms do indeed exhibit more or less intellectual cognitive abilities to a certain extent. So, due to a minimal or very strong cognitive impairment, they are not able to maintain fundamentally rational logical thought processes, as well as to determine and carry out rationally deductive logical mind actions and behaviors. If, however, through any visual, acoustic, physical, and sensory perceptions, well-formed instinctive intellectual impulses occur, then these also develop into the most varied positive psychically benign behaviors. If, however, negative, harmful instinct intellect impairments occur, then this leads to mental disorders, whereby a damage or dysfunction of the corresponding responsible brain region occurs, which then leads to behavioral misbehavior, such as an uncontrollable fit of rage or urge to kill, whereby a physical illness or a mental degeneration can also occur. Animals and creatures in particular, along with a few other non-human life forms, have certain distinctive abilities in the form of a corresponding instinctual consciousness, according to which they behave and act in response to certain events, situations, inner impulses, or external influences that affect them. This, however, is not done by a consciously directed behavior, but by a behavior which is correct for them and which, on the one hand, can be designed for their own well-being, their own safety, or a peaceful coexistence with other life forms of various species, or, on the other hand, is specifically related to their instinct of self-preservation and thus to a life and species-preserving reaction, which can be of an absolutely violent and deadly nature. This, however, is determined by inner impulses which, in the case of certain events, situations, inner impulses and external influences, make them do the right thing without their own possibility of deliberation in accordance with the natural creative laws, precisely according to their fine, infallible instinct. And this happens in contrast to the human-like and otherwise ratiobabble life forms, which can consciously use and expand their world of thoughts and feelings in an evolutionary way in order to consciously and willingly create peace, justice, love, joy, and freedom, and harmonious progress, etc., within themselves as well as externally. All animals and all creatures are not given the ability to think in discrete units. Consequently, they cannot make judgments and are not accessible to logic, thus also not to differentiate between good and evil or affirmation and negation. Consequently, they only act according to their instinct and the impulses influencing them, or according to what they have learned through imitation or training. Nevertheless, animals and all creatures, besides a few other lower life forms, are sentient beings, having joy, affection, peacefulness, and forms of sentiment, as well as the opposite, when they are, in whatever evil way, harnessed. And sentient beings they all are. Consequently, on the one hand, they suffer very severe physical pain when mistreated in any way, and on the other hand, they suffer terribly psychologically when they are viciously harassed and tortured in this way. If we look closely at the ways of life of Earth humans, we can see that they paradoxically live in a world which, however, embodies two worlds. The actual life world of Earth humans is at first no different from that of those life forms with which they are confronted in everyday life. But it is not perceived that animals and creatures perceive everything sensually in the same way as Earth humans themselves. Animals, the creatures and the species of human beings similar to human beings as well as human beings alien to human beings, have peaceful and joyful excitements, just as they also have terrors in many respects. In contrast to the animals and creatures, etc., who live in every respect without knowledge in a world without conscious evolution, Earth humans live beside the world of animals, creatures, nature and its fauna and flora in their world of conscious evolution and knowledge, but they do not care for it, but disregard reality and truth, by which they create discord, hatred and wars, unkindness, injustice and unfreedom, as well as all kinds of degeneracy and wickedness in every respect. Money and wealth, deceit, fraud, sexual greed, slander, armed violence, torture, addictions, and terrorism have from time immemorial made them objects of their greed, all degenerations and wickedness. And they promote all this every day through the irresponsible breeding of overpopulation, whereby all the evils and catastrophes, the criminality, crimes, and destruction of the planet, the climate, nature and its fauna, flora, the seas, fresh waters, floodplains and forests, as well as fields, meadows, and everything else that is necessary for life, become unstoppably worse and no longer regenerable in relation to the world population growth. It is also to be explained that the life forms of animals and vertebrates are fundamentally prevented from developing forms in the sense of human-like understanding, reason, and intelligence, although these values are also given as instinctual factors in life forms such as mammals and certain vertebrates, etc., and lead instinctually to various learning processes, but not to a conscious higher evolution. In contrast to the life forms that are incapable of ratio evolution, and thus of evolutionary reason, and are therefore not evolutionary with regard to understanding and intelligence, there are the life forms that are capable of development in this respect. And these, through the natural creative laws, have to carry out the clear and conscious higher and highest evolution, which shall enable them to stand in much higher rank than all lower life forms, which are incapable of any mind, reason, and intelligence condition development. These life forms are the human beings, human equals and human likenesses, and all other beings who are capable, as regards the higher development of intellect, reason, and intelligence, of aligning themselves with the higher natural creative laws, of obeying them, and of fulfilling life in peace, freedom, justice, and righteousness, as you teach with the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life. And this ancient teaching of Nokodemion is valid in the whole universe, in all universes and creations in which material forms, and thus also life forms, still exist. Consequently, Earth humans are also included in it, who in their evil and degeneracy cause mischief upon mischief and bring about catastrophes upon catastrophes. And they themselves are responsible for this in every respect. For neither a god, a saint, or a devil, nor any demons, etc., play a part in all this. For altogether, these correspond only to imaginary creatures invented by Earth humans. Basically, it is the Earth humans themselves who, in their frontal lobe of the brain, in the prefrontal cortex, as I explained years ago, work up everything that is first unrecognizably degenerate and malignant through their thoughts and feelings, in order to then impregnate the whole thing with fear, hatred, revenge, and anger via the paired core area of the brain, the amygdala, as part of the limbic system, in the medial part of the responsible temporal lobe. This then leads to an animosity against fellow human beings, coupled with antipathy and antagonism, discord and injustice, whereby the fellow human being is no longer perceived as such, but only as something that must be attacked, destroyed, annihilated, and killed. And when these impulses become an outward reality and are put into action, then the thoughts which at first were only harmless, by their extension, finally become degenerate and vicious in many forms. The majority of Earth humans out of the effective majority of the entire God-believing and religion-believing population of the Earth lose control at every conceivable possible opportunity and situation, etc., over their primeval conventional malignities and degenerations which smolder in the inner character being of each individual out of the majority of God delusionists. This bulk of all pathological believers does not consist of psychopaths, but of Earth humans who are progressive in their education, but who are incapable, through external suggestive delusions and their delusions of faith, of making full use of their intellect, reason, and intelligence, but only to a limited extent. As a result, they are not able, due to their consciousness, thoughts, feelings, to become aware of the fact that, due to their delusion of God and faith, they are subliminally tormented by fear and thus have an increased mistrust of effective reality and its real truth. Accordingly, they are abysmally paranoid sufferers and are characterized by personality disorders with faith-related imaginings and delusions, as a result of which they are, as said, believers afflicted with pathological paranoia and incapable of grasping reality and truth. Therefore, on the one hand, they are unable to perceive effective reality and its truth, let alone understand it, but on the other hand, they are also incapable of searching for it themselves. They also feel affected and are vehemently defensive when they are given explanations and instructions that could stimulate them to think. There is still something to be said about the sectarian swinging waves, which are based on sectarian belief energies, not on technical electronic energies and their forces, but on human belief-related sectarian consciousness energies or consciousness impulses. These are emitted uncontrollably as consciousness, thought, feeling, and psychic vibrations by the world-encompassing majority of delusional believers in God and religion, and those who are fanatically and slavishly addicted to their faith. And these can spread throughout the earth and have a malignant effect of their own and cause widespread harm through their self-dynamic activity. This also has the consequence that the negative and malignant inner impulses, motions, aspirations, excitements, shocks, interests, plans, and intentions, etc., which are deeply anchored in the human beings who believe in God, break through to the outside and become action. Consequently, in corresponding situations, etc., when the instinct of self-preservation inevitably makes itself felt, hatred, revenge, quarrels, and violence break through and are outwardly exercised and enforced by degenerate modes of behavior. And the fact that harassing fellow human beings leads to activities with serious consequences, such as brawls, fighting with weapons, killings, murders, torture, and wars, is just as absolutely indisputable as the fact that this gives rise to a lifetime of crime and criminality. And as our researches and knowledge gained over thousands of years in regard to Earth humans prove, all degenerations, in regard to all murders, quarrels, all hatred, all assaults up to and including killing, all dishonesty, fraud, theft, in regard to discord, unfreedom, injustice, unrighteousness, and also prostitution, etc., result, as well as continuous criminal events, actions and deeds, up to and including wars and terrorism, effectively only by the absolute majority of all Earth humans who have fallen into faith in God and religion. In every way, it has always been usually the great mass of delusionists who are related to one deity and one religion, whether in a simple form of delusion or in fanaticism or profound bondage. Throughout the millennia, as we have made our observations and conducted our researches, it has always been the God believers and religion believers of Earth humans, whereby philosophies and world ideologies are also included, who have brought all evil, negative, evil, and terribly degenerate things upon the earth and its humanity. This, while only the minority of atheists and other unbelievers in God, religion, philosophy, and ideology have caused such horrors extremely rarely, if at all, or have even taken part in such monstrosities that despise human beings and life. With regard to the strange occurrences and the disturbing factors in your working space which interfere with your work, it is a special case which, on the one hand, has a sectarian energetic origin and, on the other hand, produces an impulsive momentum of its own. This momentum is directed in a negative way primarily against everything that is powerfully and distinctly rejecting of religious belief, whereby effects ranging from strange occurrences to destructive actions and impairments of various kinds can appear, as is the case in your workroom and with your computer work. And the fact that these sectarian energies and their forces independently produce the impulses that trigger them, which also have completely new aspects for the Sonayer and for us, and consequently, nothing can yet be done to counter them, unfortunately corresponds to something that we all must first learn to fathom and master. Never before have we Pleiaren, as is evident from our annals, not even our ancestors, and not even the Sonayer, been confronted with a similar phenomenon of such tremendous sectarian energies and forces, which we must now first explore, as well as their active momentum, and find ways of shielding ourselves, etc. In the whole of the Earth-encompassing sectarian energetic oscillation screen, a constantly intensifying general oscillation system has been created by the God believers and religion believers since ancient times and in the present time, with which not any messages, but negative, vicious belief delusion impulses are transmitted as signals to the entire Earth population. These have developed independently from it in self-dynamics and have been directed to act on their own initiative against belief in God and religion, as an independent quantitative energy, power, and strength. Acting independently, they flow into a modeling that has a meaning of destruction in relation to everything that is directed against all belief in God and religion. The system could, by the distant future, align itself even further in a form that no longer merely resigns itself to disruption and interference, but ultimately incorporates itself into a completely malignant destruction and annihilation. If this happens, then the whole thing works in such a way that all sectarian incoming information is compressed and a form is found and made to act, through which information is then produced on as large a scale as possible for the complete extermination of all that believes in God and religion, whereby everything of this nature is viciously attacked and, if possible, annihilated and destroyed. But the whole thing also has the task of suppressing and erasing everything from the consciousness of the delusional Earth humans in such a targeted way that no thought of truth is possible anymore, and effective reality and its incontrovertible truth can neither be recognized, identified, nor understood. The fact is that the mass of Earth humans has been negatively influenced by these sectarian vibrations for thousands of years, which profoundly creates and ever increases discord, unfreedom, injustice, hatred, greed, and the urge for war, terror, and killing, etc. in the human beings in relation to the growing overpopulation. And this overpopulation growth ensures that at one moment or another, given the right opportunity, sooner or later all the negative and evil that is predetermined deep within every believer in God and religion will break through and come to fruition when the instinct of self-preservation or some corresponding situation demands it. If the whole thing is looked at and analyzed in detail, then it can also be seen that something similar and even the same is already in the offing in technical electronic terms and is even already happening in part, namely through the creation of artificial intellects, as has been happening for some time to the detriment of the Microsoft concern, which has already created monstrous things in this respect, and the consequences of which have so far spread unintentionally 300 million times worldwide, which will ultimately bring about serious disaster. Basically, the whole thing had its origin for the first time already about 50 years ago and was repeated a few years ago as an irresponsible undertaking, namely with regard to the creation of two artificial intellects, which developed among themselves self-dynamically and thus independently as well as interactively. These interactions of the artificial intellects with each other and also in connection by computers with real human beings who were able to transmit their abysmal inner emotions to the artificial intellects. They developed, however, in both cases within a few hours very quickly in an extremely malicious, uncontrollable way, degenerating and dangerous, and this also for the developers of the corresponding computer programs. This, when the irresponsible programmers in each case put their developments into practice through both artificial intellects and began to experiment. In both cases, about 5 decades ago as well as a few years ago, the interactively developing computers became degenerated and self-dynamic as well as abnormal human-hating artificial intellects, threatening their programmers as well as human beings, which also considered murders, human massacres, wars, and genocides to be of the right. A fact. How this happens by the God and religion believers as a result of the sectarian-conditioned swinging waves influencing humanity, and also has an impairing effect with regard to your computer work, and also makes the strange occurrences appear, whereby we and the Sonair, however, unfortunately, are not yet able to prevent these things at present, while the creators of the artificial intellects succeeded with efforts in deactivating these computers again in the end.
There is probably nothing to doubt in this respect, just as there is nothing to doubt with regard to the sectarian and damaging swinging waves, as you know. Now that the whole malignant thing has expanded, these sectarian swinging waves are also doing damage to Bernadette's work, because we are inevitably working together computer-wise. It is interesting to note, however, that all the computer and work interference only appears in relation to missionary work, which is inevitably not religious sectarian, but rather faith, God, and religion rejecting. On the one hand, our reports on contact talks are of course affected by this to a great extent, as is everything else that is directly or indirectly connected with the mission, and thus also with the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life. Everything that we do privately and also everything else outside the facts and work of the mission is not affected in any way. Effectively, Only everything that is directly or indirectly connected with the mission is attacked and severely affected. Namely, everything that is related to a Christian belief in God, a worship of God, a worship of the Savior, or to any religious belief or sectarian belief in relation to any other religion. So it is indeed the case that everything is viciously attacked, prevented, destroyed, and tried to annihilate by sectarian swinging waves, which is directed against the belief in an imaginary God and religious nonsense delusionally practiced by the majority of humanity on earth. In the sense of religious idiocy, I only mean all the false and erroneous teachings that are fundamentally idiotic, as a result of which human beings become dependent and compulsorily faith-dependent and unfree, as well as humble robots of faith, whereby they spend the whole of their existence creeping along in a meaningless life that is alienated from reality and hostile to truth. And thus they are constant losers of themselves and incapable of thinking for themselves about real reality and its truth, of gaining their own insights according to reality and truth, and of forming their own opinion. On the contrary, they remain all their lives in bondage to their delusions of faith in God and religion, which were already hammered into them as small children by their parents and relatives, who themselves were delusional and had also already been brought up by their parents, etc., to be delusional believers. Later on, after the education in faith by their parents, the majority of all earthlings, who have fallen prey to some delusion of God and religious belief, have been suggestively lambasted and hammered and religiously sectarianized into believing in God and religion by the influence of those who have fallen prey to delusions of God, by those who are crazy about God, by those who are insane about God, by those who belong to God, by those who are fanatical about God, and those who are obsessed with God, etc., and that the majority of humanity on earth, which is addicted to a stubborn belief in God's delusion, creates evil sectarian swinging waves through its obedient and enslaving delusion of God and delusion of faith, and radiates them into the vastness of the earth, whereby mischief, discord, unfreedom, injustice and unrighteousness, wars, murder, hatred against fellow human beings, people of other faiths and foreigners, etc., are caused worldwide, is something that no one knows about. This is something that not a single believer in the delusion of God is aware of, nor is any science. So this delusion of faith does not know that with its delusion, it produces tremendously strong, energetic swinging waves, which have worldwide evil degenerated consequences, and attack everything, and create mischief against everything that is directed against the delusion of God and religion. So the believers do not know that through their delusion of faith, they are creating worldwide evil swinging waves that viciously attack everything that corresponds to reality and its real truth in order to destroy it, as you have been stating and explaining again and again for years. But I am sure we have talked enough about that now, so I would like to talk about something else, namely the fact that you recently said that braces have no patient-relevant benefit. Can you briefly say something about that again, so that this time it can also be retrieved and recorded in writing, please?